You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. There's a woman I've met thousands of times. Sometimes she's a CEO, sometimes she's a middle manager, sometimes she's running her own business, leading teams, holding families together, or quietly being the person others turn to when things matter. She's competent, decisive, alive when there's something meaningful to do. And this part matters. She doesn't move because she's anxious. She moves because she can. The warrior doesn't step forward out of fear. She steps forward because action feels natural. Achievement for her isn't forced, it's satisfying. There's a clean pleasure in momentum, in clarity, in meeting a challenge and rising to it. She likes knowing where she stands. She likes having something real to work towards. She likes the feeling of effort turning into outcome. When the conditions are right, warrior energy is joyful. Not loud joy, grounded joy. The kind that comes from using your strength well. She doesn't need to be dragged into responsibility. She often volunteers for it. Not because she has to, but because responsibility feels meaningful. She likes competence. She respects mastery. She values standards, not as punishment, but as a form of care. Doing things well matters to her. And when she's resourced, this doesn't feel heavy. It feels clean, feels purposeful, aligned. This is the warrior in her empowered state. She's not reactive. She's not brittle. She's not sharp. She's steady. She sees what needs doing and she moves towards it without drama. She draws boundaries without cruelty. She protects what matters, values, people, direction, without needing to dominate. In her healthiest form, the warrior doesn't override others. She anchors them. People often feel calmer around her, clearer, more decisive themselves, because her confidence isn't performative, it's embodied. She trusts her capacity, and that trust didn't come from nowhere. Many warriors learned early that they could handle things. They discovered, sometimes surprisingly, the pressure didn't flatten them, it sharpened their focus. They learned that effort produced results, that responsibility brought agency, that stepping forward created momentum. And often this was mirrored back to them in really affirming ways. You're so capable. You handle things so well. You're strong. I can rely on you. For a healthy warrior, this feedback didn't create anxiety. It created confidence. A sense of, I know who I am when things matter. And achievement in this context wasn't about approval. It was about expression, using strength, applying skill, seeing something through. This is important because we so often misunderstand strong women by assuming their drive is compensatory. For the warrior, it often isn't. Achievement feels right. Effort feels honest. Movement feels alive. But, and this is where the story begins to turn, the warrior's strength also makes her visible, and visibility changes the environment around her. Because once a woman demonstrates that she can handle things, expectations quietly shift. Not suddenly, not explicitly, but gradually. She becomes the safe pair of hands, the dependable one, the person others unconsciously lean on. And as the load increases, something subtle happens. The joy of achievement starts to blur into the weight of responsibility. Not because she stops enjoying achievement, but because the conditions around it change. The warrior still wants to do things well, still values excellence, still cares deeply. But now more is riding on it. Mistakes feel costlier, pauses feel riskier. Letting things be good enough starts to feel uncomfortable. This is often where perfectionism begins to creep in, not as pathology, but as pressure. Not, I need to be perfect to be worthy, but I can't afford to get this wrong. The warrior tightens her standards not because she's insecure, but because the stakes feel higher. Her care deepens, her vigilance sharpens, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, achievement starts carrying something extra. Not joy alone, responsibility. This is not yet the tyrant. This is still the warrior doing what she does best, but the conditions are shifting. And the warrior, like all archetypal energies, responds to conditions. She adapts. She always has. The thing about warrior energy is that it's strong enough to carry a lot. And because it can, it often does. At first, the added responsibility doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like trust. You're given more scope, more autonomy, more influence. People come to you because you're good at what you do, because you see clearly, because you follow things through. And in the beginning, this feels earned. It feels like recognition. The warrior doesn't resent responsibility when it arrives this way. She welcomes it. She thinks, this matters. I matter here. There's pride in that. A grounded pride, not ego, but ownership. But responsibility has a way of multiplying quietly. One extra decision here, one extra conversation there. One more thing that somehow becomes yours. Not because anyone explicitly hands it over, but because when you're capable, the edges blur. Someone drops a ball and you pick it up, just this once. A decision stalls and you step in just to keep things moving. A standard slips and you tighten it because you care. And none of this feels like a problem. In fact, much of it feels right. The warrior likes momentum. She likes clarity. She likes knowing that what she does makes a difference. So she adjusts. She holds a little more. She thinks a little further ahead. She becomes the person who notices what others don't. And here's the part that's almost invisible when you're inside it. As responsibility accumulates, expectation follows. Not always spoken, often assumed. You become the one people check with, the one they wait for, the one who will handle it. And because you can, you usually do. The warrior doesn't keep score in the beginning. She doesn't think, this is unfair. She thinks, this is important. She believes in standards, in doing things properly, in protecting what matters, the work, the people, the outcome. So she stays engaged, but something subtle begins to shift. Responsibility starts to feel less like a choice and more like gravity. If you don't step in, who will? If you don't notice, what will be missed? If you don't hold the line, will things slide? This is where the warrior's natural care begins to take on weight. She's not anxious yet. She's not controlling. She's attentive. And attentiveness, when it goes unshared, turns into vigilance. She starts thinking further ahead, not just strategically, but defensively. She runs scenarios. She preempts problems. Again, this doesn't feel wrong. It feels responsible. It feels like leadership. But leadership here is slowly becoming solitary. Others still contribute, but the final responsibility quietly lands with her. And because the warrior is capable, this often goes unnoticed, including by her. She tells herself she's just being thorough, just being professional, just caring. But the load is no longer evenly distributed. And here's where perfectionism often enters, not as fear of failure, but as containment. When you're carrying more than your share, the margin for error shrinks. Not emotionally, practically. So standards rise. Details matter more. Execution tightens. Oversight increases. Not because you don't trust others, but because the consequences feel heavier. The warrior starts thinking, if this is all on me, I need it done properly. And that makes sense. but it also changes the internal posture. Achievement still feels good, but now it's coupled with responsibility. Joy begins to share space with vigilance. The warrior hasn't hardened yet. She's still acting from integrity, still aligned with her values, still grounded in purpose. But she's no longer just doing the work. She's holding the system together, and that's a very different energetic demand. This is the moment before pressure, the moment before sharpness. The warrior is still in her empowered state, but she's carrying more than she realises. And the environment, quietly, has become dependent on her strength. Pressure rarely arrives with warning. It doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. The stakes rise quietly. A decision carries more consequence than it used to. A mistake would be harder to recover from. Visibility increases, not just of outcomes, but of you. And the warrior feels this shift before she names it. She senses it in her body. The room feels tighter. The margin feels thinner. The cost of getting it wrong feels higher. So she adjusts, not dramatically, not consciously. She becomes more precise. She double checks. She thinks one step further ahead. She pays closer attention to details that once took care of themselves. This isn't anxiety, it's pressure meeting responsibility. The warrior still trusts herself, but she's starting to trust the environment less. Things are moving faster. Expectations are less explicit. Consequences feel less shared. And when pressure enters a system without clear support, something important changes. Trust thins. Not trust in people's intentions, but trust in the container. Trust that if something goes wrong, she won't be the only one standing there. Trust that the load will be redistributed when it gets too heavy. Trust that excellence is supported, not just expected. So the warrior adapts. She doesn't pull back. She leans in. Her standards rise, not because she's afraid, but because she cares deeply about the outcome. She notices where things could slip. She sees inefficiencies others don't yet see. She starts closing gaps before they become problems. Again, from the outside, this looks like strong leadership. Competence, attention to detail, high standards. And for a while it works. The system holds, results land, nothing collapses, which reinforces the pattern. This is what it takes. But internally, the experience is changing. The warrior's effort now carries an edge. She feels the pressure in her jaw, her shoulders, her breath. Not panic, containment. A sense that she needs to stay alert. Because when pressure is high and support is unclear, rest starts to feel risky. Slowing down feels like letting something slip. Delegating feels like gambling. Letting standards soften feels irresponsible. So she holds tighter, and this is where perfectionism becomes visible. Not as a personality trait, but as a protective strategy. Perfectionism here isn't about being flawless, it's about minimising risk. If it's done properly, it can't come back to me. If I oversee it closely, nothing will be missed. If I stay on top of it, we'll be safe. This is still the warrior. She hasn't crossed into shadow yet, but the conditions that invite the tyrant are now in place. Pressure, visibility, unshared responsibility, high consequence, and something else. Isolation. Not social isolation, functional isolation. She's still in the room, still leading, still surrounded by people, but the weight she's carrying isn't fully visible. And because it isn't visible, it isn't shared. She starts making more decisions alone, not because she wants power, but because involving others feels slow, uncertain, or risky. She starts trusting her own judgment more than the process, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. She begins to think, I'll just handle this. And there's a quiet shift here that many women recognise instantly. The work starts to feel heavier, even when it's going well. Achievement still lands. It doesn't replenish her the way that it used to. The satisfaction is thinner. The relief is shorter lived because effort is no longer just effort. It's containment, holding the system together, holding the standard, holding the line. The warrior hasn't lost her power, but she's starting to armour it. And armour changes how power moves. It sharpens edges, it reduces softness, it limits flow. Not because the warrior has changed, but because pressure has entered the system without somewhere to go. This is the moment just before the tyrant. Not a fall from grace, a logical next step. The tyrant doesn't arrive with a personality change, she arrives with a checklist. More precisely, she arrives with tasks. What needs to be done, how it needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and who will make sure it happens. This is where the warrior's relationship with action begins to shift. In her empowered state, action was expression. It was purpose moving through the body. It was strength in motion. But now action becomes about containment. The tyrant's control is not about dominance. It's not about being right. It's not about holding power over people. It's about holding the work together. The task becomes the anchor. If the task is tight, everything stays upright. If the execution is flawless, nothing can fall back on her. If the system runs smoothly, she can breathe, at least a little. So she focuses there. She zooms in. She becomes more directive, not because she distrusts people, but because ambiguity feels dangerous. She tightens timelines, clarifies expectations, steps in earlier. She rewrites things just to be safe, checks progress more closely, corrects small deviations before they turn into bigger ones. And often she doesn't announce this shift. It happens quietly. She tells herself, I'm just being clear. I'm just making sure it's done properly. I don't have time for this to unravel. This is not emotional control, this is task control. The tyrant doesn't want loyalty, she wants reliability. She doesn't want agreement, she wants execution. And because she's competent, this often works. Deadlines are met, standards are upheld, the machine keeps running. From the outside, she can look highly effective, but from the inside, something has changed in how power feels. It's no longer spacious, it's sharp. Decisions come faster, but with less tolerance for debate. Feedback becomes more direct, sometimes clipped. Patience narrows. Not because she's lost empathy, because empathy now feels like a luxury she can't afford. The tyrant doesn't stop caring, she just can't afford delay. And perfectionism intensifies here, not as an abstract trait, but as a concrete operational strategy. If it's done exactly right, there's no comeback. If it's tight, clean, precise, no one can question it. If the work is impeccable, the risk stays contained. Perfectionism here is not about image, it's about safety. And this is where many women feel a quiet sense of dissonance. They notice they're becoming more controlling than they want to be, more directive than feels natural, less open than they used to be. But they also feel trapped by necessity because loosening control feels reckless. Letting go feels irresponsible. So the tyrant doubles down. She takes on more of the task load herself, not because she wants to, but because it feels quicker, safer, and cleaner. I'll just do it. I'll fix it. I'll handle this one. And slowly the warrior's strength becomes compressed into output. She's no longer just leading the work, she's carrying it. The tyrant doesn't trust the system to hold standards, so she becomes the system. And here's the painful paradox. The more she controls the task, the less others step forward. Not out of rebellion, but because there's no space. Initiative contracts, creativity narrows, ownership migrates upwards, which confirms her belief that she has to hold it. This is how sharp power sustains itself, not through ego, through necessity. And underneath it all, there's often a quiet grief, because the warrior remembers what it felt like when action was joyful, when achievement replenished her, when leadership felt expansive rather than tight. And she doesn't understand why it doesn't feel that way anymore. She might tell herself she's just tired, that things are unusually intense right now, that once this phase passes, she'll relax. But phases stack. Pressure doesn't always lift, and the tyrant, once established, doesn't disappear on her own, not because she wants to rule, but because she's guarding something precious. The integrity of the work, the outcomes, the promise she made, often silently, to make sure nothing fails. This is the tyrant, not cruel, not power-hungry, but sharp. And sharpness always cuts eventually, including the one holding the blade. One of the hardest things for the tyrant to see is the impact she's having on others, not because she doesn't care, but because from inside her body the pace feels necessary. She's not rushing for the sake of rushing, she's responding to pressure. She's moving at the speed required to keep things upright. But the problem with sustained warrior tyrant energy is that it sets a tempo that few people can match. The tyrant is efficient. She's decisive. She moves quickly from problem to solution. She sees the next step before others have fully absorbed the current one. So she advances. And without intending to, she leaves a wake. Team members start scrambling to keep up, not because they're incompetent, but because the pace is relentless. Meetings move fast. Decisions are made quickly. Corrections happen in real time. There's little space to process, little room to ask questions, little tolerance for hesitation. Again, none of this is malicious. The tyrant isn't consciously thinking, I need to push them harder. She's thinking, we don't have time. And time, in her body, feels scarce. So she drives. And here's the paradox. The harder she drives, the more capacity she drains from the people around her. Some try to match her pace and exhaust themselves. Others fall behind and just quietly disengage. Some become hypervigilant, afraid of getting it wrong. Others stop offering ideas altogether. And the tyrant notices this, but she interprets it through the lens she's in. She thinks, they're not stepping up. They're not taking ownership. I can't rely on them, which reinforces her belief that she has to carry more, that she has to stay on top of things. So the cycle tightens. The tyrant speeds up because she feels alone. The team slows down because they're overwhelmed. And in that gap, something painful emerges. Resentment. Not always overt, often unspoken. The team may begin to experience her as intense, unapproachable, never satisfied. They might say she's hard to please or expects too much. From their side, the experience is pressure without pause. From her side, it's responsibility without backup. And this is where loneliness enters, because the tyrant often feels profoundly misunderstood. She thinks, I'm doing this for us. I'm holding the standard. I'm protecting the outcome. And yet she senses distance growing. People stop bringing her problems early. They stop challenging her ideas. They comply, but without energy. And compliance, while it's efficient, is hollow. It doesn't feed leadership, it isolates it. The tyrant didn't want followers, she wanted partners. But the pace has made partnership impossible. And here's the quiet grief underneath it all. The warrior didn't become strong to dominate. She became strong to contribute, to build something meaningful, to create momentum together. So when she finds herself surrounded by people who are tired, withdrawn or quietly burned out, something in her breaks a little. She feels frustration, yes, but also confusion. Why doesn't this feel good anymore? Why does it feel like I'm dragging everyone along? Why am I the only one who seems to care this much? And because she doesn't have language for what's happening, she often turns that confusion inward. Maybe I need to push harder. Maybe I need to be clearer. Maybe I need to raise the bar again. So the pace increases out of desperation to restore momentum. This is one of the most painful aspects of the tyrant pattern. She burns out others not because she lacks empathy, but because her own system has lost access to slowness. She no longer trusts that slowing down won't lead to collapse. And until that trust is restored, she can't feel what others are experiencing. Not fully. Because to feel it would mean confronting how unsustainable this has become for everyone, including her. And that's a truth she's not yet resourced to face. It's tempting at this point to think this is a leadership problem, a workplace problem, a systems problem, a season of life problem, and all of that may be true. But for many women, the warrior-tyrant pattern didn't begin at work. It began much earlier. Not in trauma, not in crisis, but in praise. Many warriors were noticed young. They were the ones who coped well, who achieved easily, who were described as mature for their age. They learned early that doing well brought warmth. Approval arrived when things were handled, when standards were met, when responsibility was taken on without fuss. And this wasn't necessarily harmful. In fact, for many women, it felt affirming. They discovered that competence created connection, that achievement created safety, that being reliable made them valued. So effort became familiar, excellence became normal, and responsibility became intertwined with identity. This isn't about blame. Most parents, teachers and caregivers were simply responding to what they saw. A capable child, a steady one, someone who could be trusted. But children don't just receive praise, they interpret it. And over time, acquired association can form. I'm loved when I perform well. I'm safe when I'm capable. I belong when I don't make things harder. Again, not consciously, but somatically, in the body. So the warrior grows up knowing how to rise to a challenge, knowing how to handle pressure, knowing how to meet expectations. And this becomes a strength, a real one. But it also becomes familiar to live with a certain level of tension, a certain forward lean, a sense that value is proven through effort. So when adult life presents pressure, leadership, responsibility, consequence, the warrior doesn't recoil. She recognises the terrain. This feels like something I know how to do. And when the stakes rise, when expectations stack, when the load becomes heavy, her system reaches for what's always worked. Do it well. Do it properly. Do it yourself if you have to. Not because she doesn't trust others, but because she trusts this, the strategy that has carried her before. This is why the tyrant doesn't feel foreign when she arrives. She feels like an intensified version of something already known. More effort, more vigilance, more control over execution. And because this strategy once brought safety and approval, it doesn't immediately register as a problem. It registers as necessity. I need to stay on top of this. I can't afford to drop the ball. I have to make sure this works. There's often grief here, though it's rarely named. Grief for the part of the warrior that once moved with ease. Grief for the joy of achievement without weight. Grief for strength that didn't have to be sharp to be effective. But grief takes time. And before it can be felt, the system has to slow down enough to feel anything at all. Which for the tyrant is the hardest thing. Because slowing down once meant risk. And she learned long ago how to outrun risk. By the time the tyrant is fully in place, something inside the warrior is already grieving. She just doesn't have words for it yet. On the surface, she's still functioning. She's delivering, holding standards, keeping things moving. From the outside, nothing looks broken. But internally, the experience has changed. The work doesn't feed her the way it used to. Achievement lands, but it doesn't replenish. Momentum continues, but it feels brittle. There's a dullness where there used to be vitality. She might notice she's more tired than she should be, more irritable, less patient with things that never used to bother her. Small delays start to feel intolerable. Minor mistakes feel heavier. People feel slower. And she doesn't like this version of herself. Not because she's failing, but because she feels hardened. She remembers when her strength felt clean, when effort felt honest rather than relentless, when leadership felt expansive rather than tight, and she can't quite understand where that feeling went. This is often the moment women start questioning themselves. Maybe I'm just burnt out. Maybe I don't want this anymore. Maybe I've changed. But the truth is quieter and kinder. She hasn't lost her power. She's lost her room to breathe. The tyrant has taken over the operational load so completely that there's no space left for replenishment. Rest doesn't work the way it used to. Time off doesn't land. Even stepping away feels uncomfortable because her system doesn't trust that things will hold without her. So she stays on. And staying on takes a toll. Her body carries it first. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, a nervous system that never quite settles. She might wake up already braced or feel restless when she's meant to be resting. And emotionally, something else creeps in. Resentment. Not loud resentment, quiet internal resentment. Why am I the one carrying this? Why do I care more than everyone else does? Why does it feel like I'm always the one holding the line? And resentment frightens her because it doesn't fit her self-image. She's the capable one, the strong one, the one who chose this. So she pushes it down. She tells herself she should be grateful, that other people have it harder, that this is just what leadership costs. But resentment doesn't dissolve when it's ignored. It turns inward. It becomes self-criticism. Why am I so tense? Why am I so impatient? Why can't I just relax? And this is where the warrior becomes most vulnerable because she's used to strength being the solution, and here strength is the problem. Not the strength itself, but strength without support. She's still powerful, still capable, but her power is being spent on containment rather than creation. And that is exhausting. There's often a moment, sometimes small, sometimes sharp, where this becomes undeniable. A conversation that she handles badly. A team member who withdraws. A flash of anger that surprises her. Or a quieter moment. A sense of emptiness after a win. A lack of joy where there should be satisfaction. And somewhere inside a question forms. When did this stop feeling like me? This question isn't weakness, it's awareness beginning to return. It's the warrior recognising that the way she's leading now is not aligned with who she actually is. But she doesn't yet know another way. Because slowing down still feels risky. Letting go still feels unsafe. Trusting others still feels uncertain. So she holds on just a little longer, and the cost keeps accumulating. This is the moment before change. Not resolution, but recognition. There's a word that often lands hard when women finally hear it, not because it's harsh, but because it's accurate. Over-responsible. Not irresponsible, not avoidant, not careless. Over-responsible. Carrying more than is actually yours. Holding consequences that should be shared. taking responsibility not just for your role, but for the system, the outcomes, the emotional weather, the pace. When women hear this word, there's often a pause because it reframes everything. Over-responsible didn't mean you did something wrong. It means your sense of responsibility expanded beyond its rightful boundary, slowly, understandably, and often invisibly. The warrior didn't become the tyrant because she wanted control. She became over-responsible. She began to believe, consciously or not, that if she didn't hold everything, everything would fall apart. And that belief didn't come from arrogance. It came from care, from competence, from reliability, from years of being the one who could. Over-responsibility often feels like virtue. It looks like commitment, like leadership, like strength. But internally, it creates a constant forward lean, a sense that you're never quite off duty, that the weight doesn't come off your shoulders, even when you're not actively carrying it. And here's the crucial thing. Over-responsibility is not resolved by letting go harder, because letting go feels unsafe when your nervous system believes that responsibility equals stability. So telling an over-responsible woman to delegate more, or relax, or trust others often lands as nonsense or even threat. Her body doesn't hear relief, it hears risk. The shift begins somewhere else. It begins when responsibility is named accurately. When the warrior realises some of this was never meant to be mine alone, that realisation can be emotional because it brings up grief. Grief for how long she's been holding more than her share. Grief for the joy that was squeezed out of her strength. Grief for the softness that she sacrificed to stay capable. But it also brings relief, because over-responsibility is not a character flaw. It's a pattern. And patterns can change, not through force, but through redistribution. The warrior doesn't need to become less responsible. She needs responsibility to be shared again. Real leadership support doesn't ask her to drop her standards. It asks the system to rise, to carry weight collectively, to hold consequence together, to slow the pace enough for others to step in meaningfully. And this is where something subtle but powerful begins to happen. When responsibility is shared, control becomes unnecessary. When outcomes are collective, perfectionism loosens. When the warrior no longer believes she's the final backstop for everything, her body can finally soften. Not into weakness, into trust. This is not the end of the story, it's the hinge. The moment where sharp power begins to dull, not because it's wrong, but because it's no longer needed. Because the opposite of the tyrant is not passivity, it's shared load. And that changes everything. This is not the end of the warrior's story. It's a moment before she hands something over, not to weakness, but to wisdom. I'm Ros Cardinal. This is the Archetype Effect. And next time, we'll step into the wise woman and the loneliness that can follow when knowing becomes another way of carrying too much alone. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.